listening to Seminary Dropout, and I'm your host, Shane Blackshear. Somewhere in between seminary and youth camp, it's Seminary Dropout. Let's go. My guest today is Jessica Courtney. Jeremy is the CEO of Preemptive Love Coalition, a peacemaking organization providing life-saving surgeries, relief, and development in Iraq, Libya, and other areas of polarizing conflict. While working all over the world, Jeremy has lived in Iraq with his wife and 2 children since the middle of the Iraq War. Jeremy, once again, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
I wanted to talk to you specifically today about the refugee crisis. Your organization, Preemptive Love, you and I sat down for an interview, I guess a couple of years now, and talked about what Preemptive Love does. You guys have seen kind of a change, a pivot in what your mission is about in the last couple of years, it seems like.
Yeah, I'd say we've seen a change in how we respond. Our mission is the same. Our mission has always ever only been to confront polarizing conflict and the violence of this world with acts of preemptive love. We noticed from our time living in Iraq on the front lines of these various wars and conflicts that violence unmakes the world, unmakes the lives and the worlds of people around us. And our mission has been to unmake that violence itself and remake the world around us through healing and through going to the places that no one else will go, to love the people that no one else will love. And that took on a certain kind of form in the early days of the Iraq War. And now as U.S. troops have pulled out of Iraq and we've seen this massive rise of ISIS and this outflow of people from Iraq and Syria, we've changed our responses to that violence and to the people that are in need. But I would say our mission has stayed the same.
So what are some of those responses that you're talking about? What did you do in the beginning and what are you guys doing now?
Yeah, so in the early days of our life in Iraq, I met this one little girl who needed a life-saving heart surgery. And as our family began coming alongside her and her family, we ended up finding ourselves surrounded by these kids who were waiting in line for these life-saving heart surgeries for whom there was no option inside the country. And we began bringing doctors and nurses to Iraq, to Baghdad and other places, doctors who would brave the bombs and bullets and come and save lives and train local people to do these critical surgeries for children. Then last year, when ISIS took over a third of the country, was committing mass atrocities, genocide against Yazidis and other minority groups, we found ourselves uniquely positioned in Iraq because we had built a lot of trust and a lot of reputation with some important people with different communities. We'd traveled significantly. We'd worked across all the sectarian and religious lines in the country. And with ISIS taking over so much of the land and becoming this household name overnight, we just found ourselves saying, are we working primarily about heart surgery for children, or do we have a wider responsibility in terms of how we respond to the suffering around us? And so last year, we decided unanimously as a team on the ground in Iraq that we were always going to be about much more than just this one particular response, heart surgeries for children. And so we started showing up in hard places to provide food for people who were stuck in the desert, stuck between ISIS on the one side, from whom they were running, and a government on the other side that wouldn't welcome them in. We showed up with blankets and food and provided shelter. And then after doing that for a number of months, we just started saying there's got to be more than just continuing to give handouts to people month after month after month. And so really in the last year, we've been focused very firmly on trying to provide jobs for people, jumpstart businesses, create income for those who are displaced and persecuted by ISIS. And it's been an amazing journey to make that shift from being one thing for so long, 8 years, to now adding this deeper thing in our toolbox of responses to people. It's been really amazing to engage people in their most dire need, and do it in a way that doesn't create dependencies, but actually empowers them to remake their own life.
It seems like you kind of found yourself in a place where, like you said, the kind of services the ways that you're responding weren't the ways that you had responded in the past, but kind of found yourself saying, in a way, this huge crisis is happening. The sky is falling in some ways. And like you said, you've kind of had that unique position there and gained people's trust there. And one of the few relief agencies that had, and kind of thought, well, it'd kind of be silly not to help in this circumstance.
Yeah, I mean, we really had two options. And being an international humanitarian development professional, you can kind of become over impressed with the expertise required to do some of this stuff well. We need experts, and I aspire to be one. That same expertise that is required can sometimes create a paralysis of response, where even though maybe you've got a lot of years in the field, or you have a lot of strengths and a lot of cultural insight and knowledge, but we were in a position where we could have said, what do we know about providing emergency aid to people? This whole world of humanitarian work is, maybe roughly divided into two camps. One is what you might call emergency relief type work, and the other is what you might call long-term sustainable development type work. And these two sides of the house can kind of be in conflict with each other ideologically sometimes. And so we could have said, well, we're a development organization. We work long-term to build countries and institutions and help local people learn skills. What business do we have crossing into the other side of the house and just engaging in this emergency quick response thing to keep people alive? And gratefully, we didn't do that. There is a type of expertise that is needed, but we were able to help keep tens of thousands of people alive this last year because we take the expertise seriously, but we were also willing to kind of start over again and say there's a lot we don't know. We'll learn it as we go if our people will trust us and give us the resources that we need to step into the unknown. And we're really grateful that so many of our donors and partner organizations have trusted us to kind of start over again. It's been a great honor to get to do that.
I wonder if you can kind of walk us through how the problem happens in the first place. I mean, most of us, we understand the big picture that, ISIS rolls into town. But for these refugees, what were they experiencing how did they get from everyday normal life to being an internally displaced person inside Iraq?
It's been a little bit different. We now find ourselves working beyond Iraq at the headwaters of what has become a more regional refugee and ISIS type conflict crisis. And it looks a little bit different from our work in Libya, the work we're exploring throughout North Africa, through Syria, and where we actually have our home and office in Iraq. In all those places, you find Islamist extremism. In some of those places more than others, you find dictatorial regimes. In some of those places, you find failed states that are barely functioning governments and civil war. We're concerned with that whole region. So one sweeping statement I can make about the whole region is none of this stuff happens overnight. This doesn't happen in a vacuum. The way that our media is set up, and this is not U.S. media, this is everyone's media around the world, is that certain things only occupy headline space when they are especially acute and egregious and commanding of worldwide attention. There is literally not the capacity to report on all the chronic situation that goes into these festering situations in Mosul, Iraq, and in Syria and in Benghazi, that gets us to this place. And so if this isn't your area of expertise and you wake up one day and finally this reaches the level of a worldwide headline, it can appear to come out of the blue. that's not the case. These things are always festering below the surface. There are always years and years of runway that get us to this place. And so in Iraq, this goes back certainly to the pulling out of troops, U.S. troops. That was a certain milestone along the way. It goes back to the guy who was the prime minister at the time named Nouri al-Maliki in Iraq. And there was a lot of contention around his re-election. And America really stood by him and, in the eyes of many Iraqis, helped him steal the election. And that created a lot of animosity. The way that Maliki and the military treated Sunni Muslim Arabs across Iraq during the latter part of his premiership was pretty harsh and blanketed, accusing them and assuming they were terrorists in many ways. A very similar conversation, not same, but a similar conversation that we're now having in the U.S. about systemic injustice and certain kinds of privilege and sweeping suspicions about one ethnic group over another. These were the kinds of things that were present at that time in Iraq. And so you had an opposition group trying to right that set of wrongs and offering to the Iraqi people an alternative. You don't like your government. You don't like the oppression you feel from them. You don't like the constant state of suspicion you find yourself in. You don't like going through security militarized checkpoints every couple blocks in your own neighborhood. We are the alternative. Side with us. Help us overthrow these dictatorial occupiers, and we, the Islamic State of Iraq and greater Syria, will help make things right for you. And, depending on your proximity to that group and their promises at that time, I think we had different kinds of Iraqis. We had people who genuinely wanted to believe the best about them and believed that they were going to be a good alternative. Then you had people who simply thought that they were a less terrible enemy than the enemy that was currently making life horrible. So the better of two bad options. And after ISIS came to power through collusion and corruption and gaining some of the goodwill of the people, they really showed their true colors, that they weren't going to be a better occupier. They weren't going to be a better ruler than the Shia Iraqi government that had preceded them. And it's been a hard year and a half in Iraq. It's been a hard 4 years in Syria. It's been a hard 3 years in Libya after the overthrow of Gaddafi there. And all of these situations kind of share that common theme of one ethnic group or one religious group dominating another. And that's the greater context in which we find ourselves working and competing. I think competing for ideas, competing for mind share and faith share of the better ideas that are out there in the world. That's a lot of what we're about, not just the bodily humanitarian side, but this ideological battle that this all really boils down to.
So if we can zoom in a little bit more for the family that's now displaced, did ISIS roll into their town one day and say, leave or be killed? That's a lot of the reports that we get here. Or is there more subtlety to it than that? What's it actually look like from, a feet on the ground perspective?
Yeah, in some places it looked exactly like that, where there are convoys of men waving black flags, wearing the black masks, coming into your town in a huge militarized convoy full of stolen vehicles, and they roll in, and if you're still there when they get there, they command allegiance or they command conversion, or they might give you the option to leave. But ultimately, if you don't do those things, then your only other option is to be killed. That was a common scenario. In the city of Mosul itself, which is the biggest city that fell to ISIS, it's their largest geographical stronghold now. That's the one that really shocked the world. They had control of some ground in Syria, but no one was really paying attention to Syria at that point, besides the experts. It wasn't until Mosul fell to ISIS that we started hearing more reports where ISIS had bubbled up and grown, festered inside Mosul. They didn't show up purely from the outside and say, we have now captured you, Mosul, convert or be killed. They bubbled up from the inside. They came alive from the inside. They were activated, so to speak, from the inside. And there was, there's different reports in collusion, and, I'll never have the security clearance probably to know what actually happened. But one thing that seems pretty clear is they were already there. They were in Mosul. And, we know that anecdotally as a team, because Mosul was the last great city in Iraq that we did not have active work in. We had been in communication with the governor of the governor of Mosul, trying to get one of our heart surgery programs started there. And while the governor and his doctors wanted us to come to Mosul, the governor himself basically said, you are not really safe to operate here yet because of ISIS. This was years before CNN was talking about ISIS. The governor of Mosul made it known that these guys are here. They run the city in a lot of ways like a mafia, and we could have you in the hospital saving the lives of kids, and they could sneak into the hospital and blow the whole place up, and we wouldn't be able to control it. And so we had known about the kind of underbelly of Mosul and the way that this Al-Qaeda affiliate, ISIS, at that time was already very present in the city. So I guess I just highlight all that to say there's two very different modes that this happened. One was the ISIS coming up from the inside, and then one was the marauding ISIS army going into innocent villages that had been previously untouched by any of this stuff, driving people out as a foreign invader.
Did that look like, in Mosul specifically, you talked about it bubbling up from the inside, does that look like people who were on the side of ISIS going into Mosul, blending in, becoming part of the culture? Or did it look like people who were part of Mosul sympathizing with ISIS and becoming radicalized?
Both. I mean, the people of Mosul are a historic, proud people, and so they certainly would have known the outsiders were outsiders. In American culture, we have some of that. I'd say it's still a little more entrenched in a lot of the Middle East, where if you're not from around this city, even big metropolitan cities, that's not easy to hide sometimes. So the outsiders would have been known and relatively easily identified, but there were certainly a lot of internal sympathizers as well. Do not, and this is one of the things that's kind of hard, I think, to read back into the past, but it's true. We've learned so much and seen so much about the ideology, especially the theological ideology of ISIS over the last 16, 18 months. But a lot of this was not ideological. This was not Islam driving the bus. This was not some apocalyptic millenarian death cult driving the bus that was gaining followers and adherents to that worldview. It was more political, and it was more pragmatic. It was, are you tired of being occupied by a Shia army that doesn't represent you? Join with us. Not strictly an Islamist messaging, but more of a socio-political, economic, mixed in with theology type messaging. Now, the brand of ISIS is very much, very theological, and And I think it's hard, and there's a lot of people who want to view the whole thing through a theological lens, but I don't think that necessarily represents all the rank and file or middle level people, leaders.
Has that the theological part been projected onto ISIS now? Is that in part because it looked like they overcame so many odds to take power? Is that part of that?
I think I don't. By projection, if you mean have we errantly or the West errantly projected it on them, I think we have a little bit, but more, I'd say, I think the better way to say it is that we've bought their story. We've bought the lie. We've bought the brand promise, so to speak, that ISIS marketing department wants us to believe, which is essentially that this is representative of Islam. This is being this is an accurate representation of Islam. This is true Islam, and therefore all who adhere to this way of life are doing so because they are truly Muslim, truly Islamic. That's a brand promise. That's a marketing campaign, and we've bought it, just like we've bought the idea that iPhones make us cool and perfumes make us sexy and whatever. It's just a promise, and it's not necessarily true or false. In this case, I think it's true for some people. Some people in ISIS are absolutely driven by that ideology, and it is fair to describe them as such. Other people are driven by other things, and the fact that they have aligned with such an ideological movement, or a movement that presents itself in such ideological terms, does not necessarily represent their personal motivations or their personal complexities as to why they are aligned with this thing. I see it in stratifications. There are the conquered, people who were simply conquered by ISIS, and therefore they are a part of ISIS in a way, but that doesn't necessarily say anything about their ideological agenda. They may just be going along to get along. I can imagine myself in that position, where ISIS comes to town, my kids are in threat, at risk, and I would just go along, perhaps, just in hopes that my kids wouldn't be slaughtered. Maybe a next level up from that is something more of a collaborator, where they may not understand or believe all the ideology, but they're doing slightly more than just going along passively. They might be collaborating somehow actively. In the case of Christians' houses being marked for expropriation and Christians being told to convert or leave town, a collaborator might have been someone who pointed at the house across the street and said, over there, that's a Christian family. That doesn't mean that collaborator is driven by an Islamist, apocalyptic, millenarian death cult theology. All it means is that family had a weak moment, a weak spine, wanted to protect their family, and they sold out the family across the street. That's a kind of collaboration that also does not speak to ideology. And then, you can imagine how it goes up from there. I actually see it kind of as a bell curve. I think the middle level people, some of them might be the most ideologically driven. I'm not even sure if the upper level leaders are as driven by theology as they are by power and lust and greed. They put out the theology, they put out the ideas, they promote this stuff, but does that mean they believe it? I don't necessarily think it does.
So it sounds, kind of similar to how most of our political parties, there are a lot of people that are part of specific political parties, but for very different reasons.
Yeah.
So let's talk more about the internally displaced people and the refugees. If you're someone who leaves town because of ISIS, what are your options? Where can you go?
That's a great question, and it kind of depends on your ethnicity and your religion. If you are a Christian, you can probably go pretty much to any of the safe havens, any number of cities. But
you're talking about cities within Iraq.
Cities within Iraq. Some people some people probably fled the other way to Syria, but Syria is not safe right now. So I think most, if you're internally displaced, and that means you stayed inside Iraq, our concerns as an organization extend beyond just the Iraqi people. So where do Syrian people persecuted by ISIS go? Many of them try to come to Iraq or Turkey. It depends on your religion. I mean, there's no simple way to say it, but Christians, let's just kind of go one by one. The Christians, because of the Pope, because of the media, because of the evangelical community in America, we have together, collectively, around the world, shown a spotlight on this situation. And I think, collectively, around the world, made it safer for Christians in Iraq. We, through our advocacy, through hashtags and media and headlines and marches and rallies, we have made it such that it is very difficult for someone to close the doors to a Christian. And so, thankfully, most of the Christians are safe in Iraq now. Most of the people that were at risk a year and a half ago, they were ushered in safely to the Kurdish region in Iraq. That's good news. There's a lot of people banging a lot of drums, making a lot of noise about ongoing Christian genocide in Iraq, ongoing hardness of heart and callousness from the Obama administration toward Christians in Iraq. I would say that's mostly hot air. There is something to be celebrated in how many Christians made it to safety. And that's a testament to leadership in Baghdad, leadership among the Kurds in Erbil, leadership among the Obama administration, and many, many others, the Pope and others. If you're a Yazidi, this is a small ethno-religious group that most people had not heard of until 50-some thousand of them arguably were, or a couple thousand of them, I can't remember, were trapped on this mountain. And we were seeing daily news coverage of helicopters flying overhead, filming these people surrounded by ISIS at the base of the mountain. Horrific stories have emerged of our Yazidi friends who threw their babies off the side of the mountain to their death just because they were starving to death on top of the mountain surrounded by ISIS. And they deemed it to be more merciful to throw their babies to their death than watch them wither away in 120 degrees sun with no water or food. The world, again, CNN, some other news channels, and the Obama administration shone a light on their plight. And as a result, the last year and a half has been filled with news stories and headlines and specials and documentaries about the Yazidi people. As a result, it would be difficult to turn your eye on a Yazidi family fleeing ISIS. And so most of them have found safe haven in the Kurdish region or Baghdad. But then it gets more complicated when you start talking about Shia Turkmen or Sunni Arabs from Fallujah. These are, on the religious scale, these are closer to the people that most Westerners would consider terrorists, like somehow de facto terrorists, and internal to Iraq. Even the internal Iraqi politics make these people more suspicious. And so it can be very difficult if you're a Sunni Arab Muslim to find safe haven. You can't find safety inside your own city. So one of the things that inside your own country, excuse me. So one of the things that we found ourselves, one of the saddest things we found ourselves doing this year is going out to this kind of no man's land in Iraq called Biz. In May, the city of Ramadi was overrun by ISIS. And when ISIS drove in a couple of dump trucks full of explosives and blew up a couple of dump trucks at the same time and conquered the city, 100,000 people fled on foot and ultimately got stopped at the Euphrates River They had ISIS at their backs. They couldn't go home. And on the other side of the Euphrates River was the Baghdad Shia majority government. And Baghdad would not let them in. It's almost like not being able to cross the state border from Texas into Oklahoma. And so you've got ISIS at your back in Oklahoma, but Texas won't let you in. And even though you're all Americans, and it's even more complicated than that. It's like not being able to get somewhere inside your same state almost. And so these Sunni Muslims were treated by their Shia Muslim government and brothers and cousins as terrorists and inherently suspicious, even though they had already fled ISIS. They were suffering in the desert. They were living in 120-degree heat. Grandmas were dying in the desert from lack of food and water, and there were hardly no aid groups going out to be with them. And so one of the greatest privileges and greatest sadnesses of the year was going out to those places for our team and just watching the identity politics play out and seeing these people inside their own country not have any place to rest. And it's been confusing and it's been devastating. And so you really, at least in Iraq and Syria, I don't think you can talk about the refugee crisis as though it's just one thing. Your experience as a refugee, your experience as a displaced person, actually it depends on what your background is, whether you're a Christian or a Yazidi or a Muslim.
You talk about the Sunnis in Ramadi, that they were the Sunnis were the ones that ISIS was really appealing to, right? That were saying, hey, we can provide an alternative to the Shia government, right?
Exactly. And so that becomes sort of Baghdad's plank is,
right.
Look, ISIS is Sunni. These are the people who let ISIS in. These are the tribal leaders and the tribes who are responsible for this debacle. It's their fault. Don't let them in or they're going to blow us up too. So it's just better to reject our cousins at the city border than it is to risk letting them in. And then ironically, these do become self-fulfilling prophecies because what ISIS is doing, and one of the things that we've experienced as a team over the last year is, our team has been shot at by ISIS trying to serve in these no man's land situations. Our team has been mortared by ISIS trying to serve in these no man's land situations. And our team has brushed shoulders with ISIS recruiters moving in and through these masses of people. And these recruiters are saying things like, look, your Shia government won't even let you in the city. They're going to leave you out here to die in the desert. Come back home, join us, and we'll fight them together. So, ironically, the more you lead with suspicion and self-preservation, the more you can run the risk of actually perpetuating the very thing you claim to want to defeat, which is self-injury.
And so, faced with the decision of we can either we can kill you and your family or you can join us, it's very easy to see why people might become ISIS sympathizers. Or like you said, go along to get along.
I think so. I don't think I'm above it. I think that's been one of the hardest things to hold that perspective and listen to a lot of the rhetoric that has emerged, particularly in the GOP side of the presidential run-up is these are my friends. Like we are one of the only aid organizations that has worked in hard places like Fallujah and Tikrit, Saddam's hometown, and what was originally known as the bomb factory for Al-Qaeda. We've already served some of these people. We've already saved the lives of some of their kids. I know some of these so-called sympathizers, and they're not ideologues. They weren't ideologues, and I can. They're my friends, and I can understand how they got to this position. That's not endorsement. That's not saying it's okay. I don't know if it's okay or not, but it's
very, very different than the picture that we get of of these people who are ideologues, who just join because they've always been radicalized, or they have ideological reasons for wanting to kill everyone, take over the Middle East.
Right. And don't get me wrong. I mean, I know your listenership is probably going to be more inclined to some of what I'm saying, but I don't want to give the impression that there is no such thing as an ideologue. There are. I will never seek to brush that under the rug. We've come face to face with those guys too, and they are a real threat. And that's something that I take very seriously. But I just seek to draw this distinction between the idea that ISIS is simply one thing. ISIS is not one thing. ISIS is an amalgamation of many communities, many families, many dads and brothers and cousins and uncles who are fighting and aligned and joined up for a range of ideas and motivations.
Okay, so when I keep going back to this, when ISIS comes to your town, the average refugee, the average internally displaced person, do they have cars that they're piling their possessions into? What does that look like? I guess that there's, less poor, more rich people in Iraq as well, like there are here. What's the average person's situation?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple of vignettes from friends that we've met along the way in this last year and a half. Our friend, we've probably written more about the woman, so I'll speak about the woman's name, and you can find some of these stories on our blog. But her name is Sozan, and Sozan's family is a Yazidi family that was right there on the ground as ISIS came to their Yazidi town. And one of the things I haven't referenced yet, but has been in the international media this last year, is this story about ISIS capturing so many Yazidi girls and turning them into slaves, essentially, for torture and sexual abuse and things like that. These are our friends, and these are the sisters and the daughters and the wives of my friends Sozan and Marwan and Goze. It's their wives and sisters and daughters who have been captured and are in this situation. And so ISIS comes to town, and they swept through a neighborhood and rounded up hundreds and hundreds of guys and hundreds of women. And the guys were all summarily executed right there on the spot, lined up in rows and just shot and thrown in mass graves that we're still uncovering today. The women were, by and large, captured and turned into slaves and then used to trade favors, trade for power, generate money, and mostly, I think, just give men a way to continue to exert their depraved desires.
It sounds almost like a perk of being part of ISIS.
Exactly. It's exactly how it's been held out. And, some of us believe that one of the best ways to deplete ISIS might be to rescue these girls. Because we would take, in taking back from them what they've taken from us, we would diminish their ability to just run ravenous after their military exploits. So ISIS might summarily kill hundreds of men, capture hundreds of women, but in the neighborhood right next door, as they heard this going down, as rumor was making its way throughout the city, then families like Sozan or maybe half of Marwan's family would escape. And they have kids, and they've got uncles, and they got dads, and they're left in these horrible, horrible situations of deciding, do I leave behind my wife and keep running forward to save my kids? Or do I turn back for my wife and run the risk of me and my kids getting captured as well? And just making these impossible triage decisions in the middle of the worst thing that you've ever imagined. And So our friends Marwan, Sozan, Goze, 19 of them got into a sedan.
Oh my gosh.
Between kids and adults, 19 people in a sedan, and drove until they made it to our city through difficult terrain and numerous hours waiting at checkpoints and haggling with security officials once they got to relative safety. Where are your documents? We can't let you in. We don't have our documents. ISIS took them. We didn't have time to go to our house. We just ran. But eventually they made it to where we live, where we've met them and engaged them and helped them rebuild their life over this last year. But you've got that kind of scenario where it's 19 people in August, 120, 25-degree desert heat, piling 19 people into a sedan, trying to make their way to safety. And then when they make it into a place of relative safety, the car becomes not just your getaway vehicle, but it becomes your castle. It becomes the place you live. It becomes, in the wintertime, the place that keeps you out of the snow and the rain. And so this getaway car thing is a huge ordeal. That's one vignette. That's one experience that our friends have. And then contrast that to perhaps one of our greatest honors this year was being asked by the Prime Minister's office in Baghdad to work with his people and our local Iraqi friends to charter a C-130 cargo plane. We filled it up with 15 tons of food. The Prime Minister's office met us with 15 tons of food themselves, and we flew this 30 tons of food over ISIS-controlled territory in Iraq and set down kind of behind ISIS enemy lines where no one else had gone, to this little town that was under siege by ISIS. It was an oasis in the desert of people who were still holding out, fighting against ISIS for 2 years. They'd been fighting. And the Prime Minister's strategy team was concerned that if this town fell, it would be just one more major win for ISIS. It would be a blow to security, a blow to morale for Iraqi security forces. And so he was keen to get this food to them in the desert in the summertime, a year after the official, fall of so much of the country to ISIS. And he just wanted to keep them fed so that they could keep fighting off ISIS. And so our team of Iraqis, especially flanked by the Iraqi military, goes into this little town, gets shot at by ISIS. They engage in a 45-minute firefight with ISIS. The Iraqi army is protecting this aid and shooting back against ISIS. And when our team finally made it into the city, met this guy, a young dad with young kids, who had just sold his car for 2 bags of flour. And we were coming into town with significant amounts of flour. And even though it was a huge win for us to be there, in the face of that guy, it felt like such a huge loss. We were just one day too late. And this guy trades in his castle, his getaway car, his place of safety, just so his kids could have a couple pieces of bread. And so that's kind of the two stark realities, just two stark stories that I think about right now about how this has played out in the life of different people we've met this year.
It's hard to imagine it. And when I do, I think about, if here I am in Austin, Texas, if a hurricane came or something like that, and I had to flee, maybe I'll lose my house or something like that. I can go somewhere in a different part of the country and go to an ATM and have access to, essentially my net worth.
Yep.
Is anything like that a possibility for a refugee?
No. If you don't have it on you,
it's gone.
It's not yours.
Yeah.
And that's been true for, the equivalent of a birth certificate, passport, driver's license, family tree history kind of documents, titles to your car, titles to your house, certainly cash, gold, other assets, livestock, land. If you don't have it on you, it's gone. It's not yours. You'll never see it again in most cases.
So there are people that just what they've worked their entire life for is just gone now. They're essentially starting over.
Yeah, and I don't know. I honestly don't know how to think about this sometimes, but there are two kinds of sadness, I think, is kind of where I am right now on this. There is the sadness of a poor person who doesn't have much to begin with, gets driven out of their home by ISIS,
Sure.
and has to start over. They don't have a lot of resources. They may not be that book smart. They may not be that street smart. They may not be that networked and connected. Those people are especially vulnerable. There's another kind of sadness, and that's for the hardworking, blue-collar farmer. One of the guys that we know owned a massive chicken farming operation, and ISIS came and took over the whole thing. All of his trucks, all of his farm equipment, everything. They took everything. And this guy, who was a millionaire through hard work, not any kind of silver spoon thing, but just worked hard and built a bit of a small chicken empire for himself, lost it all in one fell swoop to ISIS, and is in exactly the same situation as the poor guy who never had anything to his name. And I don't know how to think about that, but it's a different kind of sadness. It's a bigger they are, harder they fall kind of thing. And to fall from such great heights and such great comfort is something that deserves its own unique kind of empathy and response. And that's the range of people that we find ourselves working with. Now, what that businessman, farmer type has to his advantage is apparently some know-how to figure out how to do it again. And
right.
Experience suggests that those people are pretty good at starting over, because they're proven ingenuity, and it's not merely about work. It's somehow about the street smarts and the connectedness to put it all back together again. But we're working with both the poorest of the poor and those business job creator types who might just need access to some capital and some friendly foreign networks to help start over.
You mentioned about the kind of narrative that we get here in the States, and especially from those on the fringe right here. I wonder what other kind of narratives that you would want to correct that we get wrong here, that are important for us to get right.
Yeah, that's an important question, and I hope I've done I put a fair amount of minutes into the idea that not all ISIS is driven by this Islamist ideology, and I hope what comes out of those vignettes is that if all of ISIS isn't even simply that ideological, I hope we can all come to the conclusion that, therefore, not all Muslims are anywhere near that ideological. They don't carry that ideology. They aren't driven by that interpretation of Scripture. Where those certain scriptures or sayings of the prophet or traditions might have existed in the past does not mean they have dominance over certain people's lives today. So that conversation about Islam and what it means to be a Muslim, what it means to follow the Quran, that's a deeply, deeply important conversation. Muslims only comprise a relatively small part of our country, probably somewhere between 3 and 8 million by most estimates. So, somewhere around the 1% to 3% range. But there's a lot more than 1% or 3% worth of fear and politics and posturing and rhetoric that is taking up our airspace and therefore drastically affecting their lives. And so they're at a huge disadvantage. If you're only 1% of the population, how do you get airtime to make your case known? Find another group of people that's only a 1% group, and they're not going to have access to the megaphone that the CNNs and the Foxes and other big platforms are going to pay attention to. So Muslims are at a huge disadvantage in terms of trying to make themselves understood and accepted and beloved here in the U.S. right now. And so that's a huge part of what we care about and a lot of what we spend our time on, trying to help them get that market share, get that hearing, get those lines of access and friendship to Christian allies, I think, who we would want to come alongside them and love them and help them.
Yeah, that leads perfectly into what my next question was going to be, was what is the appropriate response for a Christian?
I think it's important to, for me at least, to acknowledge that I understand the fear. You don't know what you don't know, and that's just reality. No one can change that. No one can help that. All you can do is set out to know more. You can purpose to educate yourself. You can purpose to meet a Muslim and begin forming your own firsthand experiences and opinions. But without that, I understand the fear. I understand why people are afraid of the immigration refugee conversation. I understand why at the least educated levels of society there is such outsized fear over some of this stuff. That said, most of the Christians I know fancy themselves, imagine themselves to be above all that. We have this idea of ourselves, Americans in general, and I think evangelical Christian Americans perhaps in particular, have this idea that we are a cut above. And what's ironic, I guess, to me in this current setting is the level of bigotry and uninformedness, uneducatedness, lack of experience that comes shining through when we lead with fear. So I understand the fear, but I think we should desperately try to not be controlled by the fear. And where we find ourselves afraid, we should ask ourselves and seek to educate ourselves, is this fear reasonable, or is this fear being driven by ignorance? Is this fear commensurate with a rounded view of the world, or is most of my information coming from one side of the equation or another? I think the Christian's response should be to dare to take the risk toward self-sacrificing love. There are different kinds of love, and there is a love that seeks to protect its own, and I think that's appropriate. There is a love that says, I should protect my family. I think that's appropriate. There is a love that says, I should protect my country. I think that's appropriate. There is a love that says, I should protect those who are my brothers and sisters in faith who are a part of my religion or my group. I think that's appropriate. But there is a greater love than all of that. And the greater love is the love that dares to go beyond the borders that we've drawn for ourselves, dares to cross that other line and reach out to people who are not as close to us. So outside our family, welcome in the stranger. Outside our religious group, welcome in the other. Outside our country's borders, and perhaps dare to even welcome in the enemy. I don't think that love is irresponsible. I don't think that love is naive. I don't think that love is childish or foolish. I think that is the highest kind of love when it's done not flippantly, when it's done intentionally, when it's done motivated out of place of, for the Christian, wanting to actually be like Jesus. The Jesus story is nothing if it is not a story of crossing enemy lines. It's pure, unembodied spirit divinity daring to cross into the embodied world of space and time and stuff and take on flesh. If that's not scary, so to speak, for the Godhead, I don't know what is. And then this God in flesh goes to the cross to love the enemy who are not his. If that's not scary, I don't know what is. And so we claim to be Christians. We claim to be ones who are made in the model and the way of Jesus. And yet it's so rare that we call each other to love and live just like him.
Can you think of some things that are some practical steps that we can do to help this situation in general, specifically to help refugees?
Above all else, meet a Muslim. There is nothing right now in this setting, because I think we're kind of at square zero. There's nothing that could be more revolutionary than to meet a Muslim. They don't even need to be a refugee. Meet a Muslim. They are somewhere between 1% and 3% of our country. Not very many, so it's going to take some effort. And it's that effort alone that is going to make it profound. Because for all the rhetoric and all the talk out there, it's not like we're all just bumping into Muslims every day and trying to figure out how to stay alive from the crazy, psychotic, terrorist Muslims among us. Right. You're going to have to seek these people out. And that shows a purposefulness to the love. And I think from there, depending on your city, depending on the refugee situation, things will develop. But if every church was led by people who truly knew Muslims in their own area, we would not be in this type of heightened fear that we are right now. All of the people I know who actually know Muslims are not at all being tossed about in these political back and forths about refugees right now. Knowing a Muslim seems to be the defining characteristic of those who are reasonable right now in this space. And so I think that's one of the things that I would encourage people to do. And let me just bring it home to say, when I say that, oftentimes people say, well, what does that do to help the refugee situation today? I don't know if it will do much to help the refugee situation today. We kind of made our bed that we're sleeping in today, we made it years ago. And if we want to have a different country and a different culture and a different church years from now, we got to start today and set our sights on the horizon for who we want to be down the road. Today's refugees may be screwed because of who we've been over the last decade. But next year's refugees and 10 years from now's Muslim neighbors don't have to live in this sense of discrimination and suspicion and fear that we've set for them today if we start changing who we are as the church and as American communities today.
Well, and I can also say that for sure, if evangelical Christians were pro-immigrant, if they were encouraging refugees to resettle here, we sure wouldn't see these governors coming out like they're doing and trying to deny the refugees. And I don't know if there's any the legal ability for them to actually do that, but making the statements they have, and for sure at least making refugees not feel welcome here.
Right.
These are, and this might be read as cynical, but these are people who are licking the tips of their finger and raising them to the wind to see which way the wind is blowing. And so if the wind blew in a direction that was loving, that was kind and welcoming, then they sure would not do these things that would be very unpopular.
I agree. I mean, as much as I love to pick at the current class of politicians leading us, in most cases, they are just a symptom. They are not the problem.
Absolutely.
We are the problem. Yeah. And they are simply a reflection of who we are and who we want to lead us. And if we want a different class, then we have to stop voting with our dollars and our eyeballs and our actual ballots for people who gin up suspicion, who prey upon fears, and who promote the most negative, cynical vision of the future.
Yeah. We're the ones making it politically advantageous for those politicians to make those statements. Jeremy, it means so much that we can sit down and talk to somebody who really has a feet on the ground view of what's really going on. And so I'm just so thankful for you and for taking the time to come on and talk to us.
Absolutely. Always honored to spend time with you, Shane.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Seminary Dropout. Remember, you can find all the show notes for this show and all shows at shaneblackshear.com. Oh, and hey, have you ever thought about starting your very own podcast? I bet you have. And I think you should do it. In fact, I've created a course just for you to teach you everything that I've learned over the last couple of years producing Seminary Dropout. So if you're interested in podcasting and want to learn how, go check out my course. You can go there by typing in podcastingforeveryone.org. And you can get a special discount by typing in the discount code Seminary Dropout, all one word. That'll give you 25% off. So go check it out. If you have any questions, let me know. Okay. Thanks to those that left ratings and reviews on iTunes this week. Remember, that keeps the show front and center. Also, remember, you can find me on Twitter at beardonabike. That's at beardonabike. Also, I'm on Facebook, facebook.com/ShaneBlackshear123. And remember that Seminary Dropout is listener supported. You can visit supportseminarydropout.com and press Become a Patron. Remember, this music you're listening to right now is by D.L. Rossi. You can find him online on iTunes and at dlrossi.com. All right, thanks again for joining me for another episode of Seminary Dropout. Stay tuned for next week's episode. Love you. Take care.